It's now my pleasure to introduce the chair of our first panel. Henry Stott is a partner and national leader in the sustainability and climate change practice at Deloitte. Henry has over 17 years of experience in strategy, risk, and governance. And his passion for environmental and social sustainability issues management developed over time while consulting for mining and energy industries. So I'd like to invite Henry, Chris, Mark, and Mark to stage.
Welcome, everybody. I have Mark Wiseman over here, Mark Dorr, Chris Adachi, and Mark Passy over here. I'm Henry Stott. As Adrian mentioned, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. we're going to be talking about a number of things today, just setting ourselves up for this great 2 days here together. And one of the things I'm going to start off by doing is just asking each of the panelists here to briefly introduce themselves, just for a minute or two. Tell us a bit about your role and what you do, and then we'll jump through a bunch of questions and have a good discussion here. And after about 40 or so minutes, we'll maybe pause and get some questions from everybody over here. So maybe we'll jump straight into things. Mark Wiseman, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm the Vice President of Sustainability for Avalon Advanced Materials. We're in the lithium rare earth metal space, which is fairly important for the folks out there, I think. 39 years in the business, more or less, but I'm here to represent the exploration and development side of mining, because that's where I've been for the last 6 years or so.
Should be on.
Hi everybody, my name is Mark Dorr, another Mark. I'm a passionate African, born in Malawi, grew up in Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, lived in Zimbabwe, South Africa, now living in Namibia for the last 30 years. And I'm very much involved in the development of our continent. Currently the country manager and CEO of Beta Gold Namibia. We have a new mine there called Otjikoto Mine, and we're putting up a fairly large solar PV plant, hybrid plant with some interesting side aspects to it. We're looking at a three-way hybrid, and I'll be sharing that with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks. Chris Adachi with Tech Resources, though reconsidering calling myself Mark for this week, it looks like. But yeah, my role at Tech focuses very broadly on anything really related to climate change. So whether that's looking for emissions reductions at our operations, looking at renewable energy, disclosing on our emissions, engaging with shareholders on some of the work we're doing, as well as thinking about resilience to the physical impacts of climate change. So sort of it in a broad bucket, but hopefully we'll get into some more detailed conversation today.
Mark Passy with Glencore, Energy Manager here in Ontario, responsibility for our operations for natural gas and electricity in Timmins and Sudbury. I focus a lot on commercial aspects of those two commodities, but process improvement, sort of a firm believer that the cleanest megawatt is the one I don't use, and so I'll be talking a little bit about process improvement.
Excellent, thank you. So as you can see, we have a great spread of expertise here, from the exploration side to geographically dispersed Africa, the Americas, somebody based right here in Canada as well. So each of you has been quite successful in your own right in terms of focusing on energy-related initiatives within your organizations. And what I'd like for you to share as a starting point is just how things are set up in your organization. So what I mean by that is there are a number of enablers that make things go well and that enable you to succeed when you want to implement certain initiatives, when you want to table certain business cases. So from an internal focus perspective, an expertise perspective, who leads, how is it organized, kinds of skills. From that perspective, I'm curious to just get a sense of how things are set up in your organization. So maybe Mark, we'll start with you over here.
Okay, so for an exploration development company, we've only got 12, 13 people in the organization, and there's a guy like me who's got to be a jack of all trades and master of nothing. But as a small exploration company in the business that we're in, we need to be sustainable, and we are selling directly to the customer. We're not providing any supply to a London Metal Exchange or anything like that. So we're required to be green, and being green means that we have to have a low carbon footprint, among many other things. As a result, again, with a small group of people, we've developed an internal culture where we know that this is secret to our success, and therefore we're all buying into what we need to do to get that carbon footprint down. So that's everything from process change through to reducing your day-to-day use to just maybe changing where you put your plant.
Great. So a small team and closeness amongst everybody in terms of thinking to how to run the business, and this being an important issue.
Sure, and everybody aligned. And when you've only got 8 or 10 people, it's easy to do.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Mark, from your perspective.
Yeah, I think quite apart from it being the right thing to do these days to move towards green energy, sustainable energy, it obviously has to make economic sense. And in our case, if it hadn't made economic sense, I don't think I would have been successful with my board to raise the prospect of a project as large as we have at the moment, with several phases. We're busy with phase 1 at the moment. So I think the critical thing here is to have the buy-in of the group, of the corporation, as far as the ethical aspects, the social responsibility aspects of, not necessarily social, but also, let's say, environmental, climate responsibility aspects of moving green. And that I have. There was no doubt about that from the beginning, that I had the buy-in from everybody. But having said that, for any project, if it's not going to make economic sense, especially when you're starting up a mine and you're competing in the world market, obviously commodities are very cyclic, you're not going to it's not going to fly. And recently, with the advance of PV, CSP, and all green technologies, it has become economical, especially in a country like Namibia where we have so much sun.
Great. And we'll touch on that a bit more in terms of business casing as well. That's great. Chris, from your perspective, just building on that, how are you guys organized to kind of make this succeed?
Sure, and you'll probably have to cut me off. We could probably talk about this for a couple hours. But I'd say the starting point for us actually goes back to about 2010. And our CEO gave us a very clear mandate about maintaining social license to operate and thinking about what the key risks and opportunities are around sustainability. And having a mandate from your CEO to look out there what your sustainability issues are is quite empowering in the organization. And to no one's surprise here, I'm sure energy and carbon came up as one of those top risks. And around that same time, he also mandated several of our senior vice presidents. So these are people who are reporting directly to our CEO. And what's key about this story is these were our senior vice presidents of copper, of zinc, of steelmaking coal. So this was coming from the operating side of the organization, and mandated them to make sure that we met our sustainability goals. So at that time we set 2015 and 2030 goals. So I'd say that, first of all, that leadership piece was really key, and it's maintained over time. And in fact, I'd say our board has more and more questions about climate change these days than they did about 5-6 years ago. So I think we've got that leadership. I think we've got some key drivers that motivate people. We do pay quite a bit of carbon tax, and I'll talk about that later today. So I think some of that motivation's there. And then I don't have enough time to go through an org chart of the various people who touch on energy management, but it's finding those key people who control it, as well as some of the decision makers in terms of our project decisions, and making sure that they're thinking about energy cost, carbon cost, and thinking about it sort of over the longer term, because it's easy to think about 2-3 years down the road and not think about what some of those escalating costs are going to be over time. And that last piece I guess I'll close on is we've got really good people in the organization. So, it's one thing to have it being driven down by the top. It's one thing to have it as risks, but we've got a lot of people, and it's not just people who think about energy day to day. It could be somebody in our maintenance reliability groups. It could be somebody working on reclamation, and they come forward with good ideas. And we try and foster as many of those good ideas as we can and get them out there to implement when they make sense. So it's having a solid employee base who think about these things and who are willing to speak up and share their ideas.
So I'll go back a little farther than 2010. I guess it's when I started with the organization, and in advance of Glencore, who we are today, was Falconbridge. And the first project I worked on, I was in IT and working on that, and it was all energy related. And so back in the 80s, we were fortunate to have superintendent of engineering. So quite fortunately, you walk in and there was a culture of energy management, understanding of electricity within the operations. So Falconbridge, now Glencore, has had that philosophy going along. And then I show up in the 90s with more of a commercial aspect. And so then we end up with engineering and business coming together, and what that means to change the philosophy within the organization, coming at it from a multi-pronged approach. Obviously, like yourselves, you need good leadership at the top to support that. It's expensive. Nobody really understands the payback on these things, right? But you go through and you start to optimize processes, and then along the way, ventilation on demand, these are the projects that came in. We did that, primarily, largely without funding, started that, and that really caught on. So you have success from an engineering perspective, and you have it from a commercial perspective, and then it just kind of grows from there. So.
Chris, I'm going to come back to you, and was curious, I know a little bit about the tech story, and others in the room may know as well. I'm curious how in the organization climate goals and energy strategy have been linked internally. So really understanding where this finds a foothold in the business for leadership, and does it start with an external push, but really that link between climate and energy, is it very much, it's an energy management focus, and climate change is something that's separate, and carbon management is seen as, or climate change, should I say, is entirely separate to your energy management piece, or are they really viewed as an integrated initiative?
They're definitely integrated. So I'm going to do a bit of tech speak for a second, and we have 3 very specific goals. One's around energy reductions, one's around greenhouse gas reductions, and one is around renewable energy. But of course, we have a broader strategy when it comes to addressing all the risks we have tied to climate change. But I'm just going to speak to those first 3 goals for a second. So I work with all of our operations. I work across the organization in meeting these energy and greenhouse gas goals, and they're synonymous, right? I mean, you can talk to one person, they'll say energy. You'll talk to one person, they'll talk about greenhouse gases. But when we track our projects, when we assess the projects, we're tracking both all the time, right? I mean, I could put up an Excel spreadsheet, which I'm sure some people would be bored by, some people would love, just listing all the different projects we have out there. So those are integrated. The other piece for us is, we have an opportunity in trying to meet our renewable energy goals to pick jurisdictions where we're going to get the best bang for our buck in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with British Columbia, our tech, most of our operations are in British Columbia, which from an electricity standpoint makes it pretty challenging to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. But we have operations in Alberta and in Chile. And so when we're thinking about the commercial aspects of energy, when we're thinking about how we're going to meet our goals, that conversation comes together. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If you'd asked me that probably 3 or 4 years ago, it'd be a slightly different story, I think. That maturity takes time for people to learn, but I may be the worst person in some ways, always talking about energy reductions, and people at the operations and the organization are the ones who always bring greenhouse gases back to the forefront, which, of course, part of my mandate is what I think about most of the time, but I'm not sure I realized how much others in the organization are cognizant of that as well.
And Mark Passy, from your perspective, does there need to be a link between energy management and climate change in particular, and coupling those two together? Have you found that helpful? Has that been, I'm just curious from your perspective.
So for sure, I think, and if you look at the Mining Association of Canada, there used to be reporting that was different for energy and GHG. Now it's very much one and the same. And I think where that maybe manifests itself, and I forgot to mention this on the last question really, is where does it lead to? Well, it leads to you start to do a new project. You can do so much with an as-built property, but as you go through, so in 2016, we started looking at new projects purely from an energy design review perspective and that lens. And so when we did that, we didn't do it just from the electricity, but it was very much about what are our carbon reductions and how do we save that? And then that leads on to the next part of it, is what are the policies required in place within the jurisdiction that you operate? And then you got to educate sort of the people within the ministries of that. And so that comes into when you start to do those reviews, you capitalize and you bring all together, your energy reductions, your GHG reductions, and then you bring in the piece on innovation, and that really sparks the business case. And that's kind of why I mentioned the commercial aspects, because it is, at the end of the day, unfortunately, it is about money, and it is about driving down costs. And so that's where that really trifecta comes together, and that's where you get the adaptation of newer technologies within your operation.
You touched on innovation there, and I want to jump to Mark and Mark over here. You described a pretty well-structured thought process there, and I'm curious from your perspectives, how formalized do you need to have innovation be a strategy to actually drive energy and climate change initiatives? Is it something that in your organizations is focused on as a specific domain, or is it something that it's more on a project-by-project, business case-by-business case perspective? Maybe we'll start with yourself.
We're a young company, B2Gold, and I must say we don't have a formalized system of looking at each operation case by case. We're probably one of the fastest growing gold companies in the world, and to be honest, that doesn't really feature at this stage, although the conscience is there, the fact that we've got to do the right thing is there, perhaps more than most. And, you know, with just last week, I don't know if you're aware, and this group is probably aware of it, there was the second warning to humanity by the greatest assemblage of scientists in the world, that we're at the tipping point with our planet and that we have to do something about it. The first warning was heeded to a certain extent, you know, with ozone depleting gases and that sort of thing, so mankind can make a difference. But with the second warning now being a lot more dire than the first warning, I think that any company, any forward-looking company that operates, especially mines, and let's face it, mines have had a bad rap environmentally, socially, and all sorts of aspects of mining operations historically. Any forward-looking company these days has to embrace new technologies, has to embrace planet-friendly technologies. And so I think that as we grow as a company, we'll be formalizing our policies with regard to where we operate mines, how we operate them, what our carbon footprint is. And so it's very much interlinked between, you know, the economic aspect of it, commercial aspects, which now makes total sense in most places in the world, and the formal approach to green energy.
Great. And for yourself, Mark, in terms of innovation and a focus thereof? Yeah.
Well, for us, it's all about innovation. We're fortunate. We have no operations out there that we need to change, so it's a blank slate for us. On the other hand, it's a bit challenging because we have no operating income, so fortunately, the Ontario and federal governments have been coming through with some financial support to do some really interesting, innovative work. So changing the lithium manufacturing process from a 3-step to a 2-step. That's huge in terms of just the amount of work that has to be done, but what we're finding is really remarkable is all the secondary benefits. $24,000 a year reduction in greenhouse gas, $1.2 million at $50 a ton, just in reduced transportation cost of reagents, reduced water use. The new process has far less waste, so you're not shipping all that waste or building those facilities. The benefits are just all throughout the chain, and when you're sitting around the table, you're all looking at these wonderful benefits you're getting. We were looking at building our camp in the NWT under a dome. We thought, well, that's really good. It'll save on camp heating costs, but there's many other benefits. It's a lot easier to construct a camp under a dome than in a blinding snowstorm. You know, and you can get your fresh food manufactured under that at the same time, which gives you an advantage to getting people in an environment where it's really tough to get people. There's so many other benefits that you don't think about, and the opportunity to innovate is the key to being able to reduce your greenhouse gas footprint. We can even move our plants to areas where the energy is cheaper and greener for some of our value-added options. So yeah, and when at the greenhouse or at the exploration and development stage, innovation is absolutely the key to what we're going to do.
Chris, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, your question's a very timely one for me. I was in London all of last week with member companies from ICMM, so that's the International Council of Mining and Metals. You've got your BHP, Glencore, Rio Tinto, Teck, 25 companies, I think, that are part of this. And the reason why we got together last week was to tackle this innovation challenge. So we actually got the member companies and we got a number of the OEMs in the room together to try and talk about what does mining look like 15, 20 years down the road. And I'd say one of the things that we observed, and I think this is true of tech as well, is everyone's at different stages of maturity in terms of thinking long-term strategy on innovation. And I think one of the reasons we struggle with that, what I was hearing from a lot of colleagues in that meeting, was as organizations and as an industry, we've had a bit of a shotgun approach to looking at innovation, and we haven't shared information for obvious reasons in terms of competition. And so, people are looking at different technologies, and the same technologies are being assessed in different ways in different companies. And the outcome of the meeting was to say, how can we be more effective at this as an industry, respecting competition. But COSIA has a model for this in Alberta, and trying to find ways where can we accelerate this, because ultimately it's an industry challenge. I just thought I'd share that about innovation. I think everyone's still learning about this. And the last piece I wanted to add is technology is evolving, especially digital technology, so quickly. It's really challenging to try and plan 15, 20 years if you've got a mind that can have that kind of lifespan, and trying to predict what's going to happen in 2 years is hard enough. So I think there's so much change happening right now. I think a lot of companies are still struggling to figure out, how do we take those innovative leaps without exposing ourselves to so much risk? Just some color on it.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. And I know that there's a lot of discussion on innovation these days, as you point out, and the discussion of how to actually codify innovation. It doesn't just happen on its own. It doesn't just magic doesn't just occur spontaneously. You need to really enable the right kind of mindset. You got to enable the right decisions, and failure. Frankly, you need to be able to fail fast and allow things to happen, and espouse the right environment for success. You mentioned this is an industry problem, and I'm glad you touched on that. And I'm curious, Mark Passy, I'll come to you on this question, and then we'll hear from everybody else around the concept of some of the barriers and enablers of target setting. So if we think of this as an industry problem, which is what you touched on there, and you think of it from a climate change and emissions perspective, and just from an external focus perspective, target setting and internalizing that within your organization, is it a helpful, is it a hindrance? What have you found has worked? Have you even looked at science-based targets, dare I say? I'm just curious from that perspective.
Yeah, so from a corporate perspective, we have global emissions reductions. And I think these are the things that help us adapt technology. And I'm glad you mentioned about the 2 years out. So 2 years ago, we were doing energy design reviews. So part of that, you bring into the emissions, you're evaluating that, and you're looking at technology. We're embarking on that again. And now we're looking at 2 years later, we're looking at brand new technology. So probably, I think, for a long time we talked about ventilation on demand. And it was kind of the hot topic, and we talked about it for about 5 years. So 2 years ago, we weren't talking about maybe small nukes or hydraulic air compressors or something like that. Well, 2 years later, it's on the radar. And so the step changes you're allowed to do, now we're seeing the step changes reducing your energy cost by 50%. So it's no longer 3 or 4% and that sort of thing. That technology is coming at us. We're partnering federal and provincial government. I think what the ISO has done with the Industrial Accelerator Program makes those funds available for innovation, and then it's starting to work, and we're starting to see those adaptive technologies. And it really starts from, back to the questions about what are the targets. And so you set targets, you're looking at them, and then you blow them out of the water. You do ventilation on demand, and you end up reducing your energy consumption by 40%, right? And now you're looking at, and I think there's some guys in here, now you look at a whole new, different way of compressing air. Well, that's a reduction of 50%. So you set your, 3-4% reductions, and then you come along and there's a step change. And I think it gets back to, Laurentian University, 40% mine. And everybody kind of laughed at it. But then when you get these massive changes in the way we run our businesses, they're achievable. And sort of the catalyst for that is, what are your energy reduction targets? What are your GHG? What are your emission reduction? And it all comes together to make a good, solid business case for the investment committees that we all report to.
Often a lot of pushback to set those targets and go public with them, though, for a variety of concerns. But is that something that you experience as well, that you see as well?
Yes.
Chris, maybe you can build on that in terms of target setting and the process around that internally, and also what kind of challenges around that. Disclosing that publicly, is it worth it? Is it not? Does it actually inhibit people because they fear of failure around that? What do you think?
I don't think fear of failure. I think we'd rather, or at least at Tech, the culture is, you'd rather set a further goal and come up short than just put something easy, knock it out of the park, and put in your sustainability report, we did it. I think there's an honest drive to try and set further goals. I mean, there was no question of whether or not we are going to publicly state these. It was just really, in some ways, internal, saying, let's try and set goals that push us out of our comfort zone, but that aren't so far that today we think they're unrealistic. And I'd say the biggest piece for us, not to emphasize too much the soft side of the organization, but it's actually the culture piece. I mean, we could have picked a whole bunch of different numbers, but at the end of the day, having targets gives some direction to our general managers and to our operations of, look, you need to go further. I mean, that's the key message, and you need to be thinking about this, and when you're doing 5-year plans, 2-year budgets, whatever cycle it is, you need to include some form of energy or greenhouse gas goal. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces for us. I don't think any of us would be immune to having the debates you're alluding to in an organization. Should we do it public? Shouldn't we? Is it too far? Is it not? Like, you're going to have that anyway, but once you have it, we can all point to that. We've got a unified direction. So I think that was the key piece for us.
And Mark and Mike, you both are from obviously smaller organizations, but still, I would expect there would be a culture of target and goal setting amongst a variety of metrics, not just energy and climate change. But does that extend in a smaller organization like both of you are from into something like energy and climate change or energy and carbon?
Yeah, I'd like to answer your point, I'd like to touch on what you said a little bit earlier about technology not just happening, by accident. And I want to quote Elon Musk there when he talks about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are going to happen. It's inevitable. The inevitability of everybody moving towards electric vehicles is now pretty obvious. I think there's not a single car manufacturing company and truck manufacturing company now that's not looking at it. But it's not inevitable that we're going to go to Mars and we're going to become an interplanetary species. However, that technology could, cause us to develop in leaps and bounds. And so I think there has to be a policy shift, there has to be a change of mindset that we've got to embrace new technologies. In our case, in mining, the inevitability of moving towards power is driven by the economic justification, by the commercial justification, clearly. However, I think it should be far more than just that, because the way things are changing, and once again coming to the point that planning 2 years ahead in mining is pretty difficult. Storage technology is changing so quickly, and we haven't built any storage into our particular phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of our operations. We're looking 5 years ahead. But for all we know, within 2 years, storage will become very viable, and it is already. Some of you out there would already have put in storage. And so, right now to embrace that technology as part of green energy is very important, to realize that it's changing so fast that it's necessary to look at what's potentially going to happen in the future. And that'll be driven by policy. It'll be driven by corporate decisions and policy, in my opinion. So it's very important, that linkage between corporate thinking and what's commercially viable.
Absolutely. And from a kind of target setting perspective or a focus, again, is it seen as something that needs its own unique focus, or is it, again, in a small organization like yours, something that's folded into your role? You're overseeing a number of metrics in terms of how the business operates and runs. Is it expected that this would be treated the same way, this being energy and/or climate change? Energy and/or climate change, or is there a unique call out for that in terms of your organization?
In our organization, we're so busy building up the company, and we're going to be a major next year. I don't know if you heard that. So we're not that small, by the way. Yes. And I think it takes time to develop policies while you're building operations and doing them in a sustainable way and giving back to communities, giving back to building minds of social conscience, as we do, and a lot of other companies do here too. I think it's inevitable that we will get to the stage where these sort of policies become entrenched in our modus operandi. we can't just act as though we are, buying up properties and building mines without a view to the future and without a view to giving back, which we're not. So yeah, very much so. I can see us within a year to 2 years developing a very, very, let's say, entrenched policy, as you guys have at Tech, and other big companies. It's really important to embrace that.
And Mark, for yourselves at Avalon, the targets, goal setting, does that feature in terms of how you run and operate?
We don't tend to have the kind of 5% reduction next year because we don't have any operations. We're still looking at that step change opportunity to really drive down what our GHG footprint's going to be. Looking at a wide variety of innovations, looking at partnerships, in particular with First Nations and those sorts of things, trying to think out of the box to come up with new and better ways to bring our cost and GHG footprints down is the key area that we work on.
Excellent. Well, I want to transition a little bit to focus on decarbonization and renewables. And I know, Mark, you and I were talking a few days ago at some of the interesting business cases that you had made and implemented there. And I wouldn't mind hearing from each of you around some examples of how renewables is aiding in decarbonization in your businesses. But maybe we'll start with you, Mark, to tell us a little bit about the business casing process, what's worked well, where have you been challenged around renewables? Curious to hear a bit more from you.
Yeah, so as we discussed a couple of days ago, I think that one of the things that really excites my group and myself especially is the fact that solar will continue long after mines shut down. The current norm is 25 years, but if you keep on changing your panels that are becoming less and less effective, you could keep it going ad infinitum. Really, and what are you going to do with that power post-mine closure? And one of the biggest issues that we have in the mining industry is that all mines shut down. We deplete our resource and we run away, usually leaving a big hole in the ground, bit of an eyesore usually, and for that reason we get a bad rep. So we see this particular plant that we're building and other plants that we're looking at building in our group now as being a fantastic social closure option, whereby we could potentially, and I need to say that this has not been decided upon or agreed to by the executives in my company, but they've certainly given me a thumbs up to investigate it, to literally hand over the plant to the communities. And the plant will continue to, in our case, we're an island producer. We have a 24 megawatt HFO plant, but we're linking in our PV plant, and phase 2 will be linking into the grid. So selling power at a rate that is cheaper than the grid can buy power in Namibia would generate literally millions of dollars on a monthly basis. And if our company is that forward-looking and that progressive, that it says, well, look, we're not in the business of selling power. We're in the business of mining gold at this stage, potentially other metals too in the future. Why don't we just see this as a lasting legacy issue and hand this plant over to the country, the communities, to especially our environmental conservation efforts that I'll be talking about this afternoon, as a continuous revenue stream from nature that the sun is giving us forever. And so we believe this model could be duplicated, and it could improve the image of mining throughout the world. That it's not necessarily true that post-mining you have a negative legacy. You could have an extremely positive legacy for the entire country and community.
Great. Chris, for yourselves, renewables, how's that featured for Tech, and how does that continue to feature going forward?
As I mentioned, one of the challenges we have right now is just that we've got a wealth of access to low carbon electricity, period. Challenge, opportunity, we're quite pleased with that. But in terms of the business case side to this too, we're looking at some of our operations that are either off-grid or that have more coal-based generation in their grids. And it's pretty standard business for us now, especially when we're looking at our operating costs for future projects. Incorporating renewables in there it just makes sense for us. I think we've moved past this point of having to prod people to say, hey, think about solar in Chile. Of course, they're going to look at it there. One of the things, a message that I guess I'd share with folks here today is it takes time to transition. There's complex natures in terms of our PPAs. There's some complexities of the way national grids evolve. There's complexities how governments want to incentivize or facilitate these transitions. And so, mining often moves at a different pace than I think some other people would like. So that's one of the key messages I wanted to share. And I guess one other sort of pet peeve is not the right word, but one nuance is, for me, and this is something I spent time working on in tech, and it's not just about electricity, it's looking about, looking at lower carbon fuels, whether it's for our haul trucks or shovels, whatever piece of equipment it is as we see all these different carbon policies coming into place, understanding how to integrate those into your assessment. And just as an example for people, I think everyone here is aware that Canada's going to go up to this $50 a ton base price by 2021, 2022. And so understanding what that means, you should put in terms of cents per liter of diesel when you're doing your analysis going forward. It's not always intuitive to people. So making sure that when people are doing these financial assessments, they're thinking about that. They're thinking about funding from governments. They're thinking about other risks they can mitigate. I think, putting that culture in place to think about that, and then supporting the people making those assessments with the technical analysis they need. I think that's really key to making sure that people are doing the proper analysis, so that instead of transitioning 30 years down the road, it's 20, it's 10, it's 5, whatever it is, right? It'll accelerate if we do that analysis a bit better.
When I come back to that, I'm glad you raised and you used the word proper analysis. I'll come back in a second, but Mark, I wanted to just make sure we hear from you as well on the renewables side and just your thoughts and perspectives.
So similarly, in Ontario, Northern Ontario specifically, our electrons are 99% carbon free, and so we're using that. And so how do we use that? And I think the electrification of the underground mine, that is happening. Products are being developed, KL Gold in the other week or whatever, they're getting a 40-ton truck. So you're seeing that energy density. So using that renewable power that's abundantly available in Northern Ontario. Of course, we've had people from Glencore here before speaking on the implementation of wind up at our Raglan operations. We've got significant hydro assets where that's available. I think one of what we're also looking at, and I think this is really important, and maybe some of my mining colleagues won't share this, but it's really the implementation, I think, on the storage side that you talked about is the elimination of rare earth minerals within storage technology. And so how do we do that? How do we implement that? How do we encourage that with, places like MIT that are doing great research? Sorry, Mark.
Yeah. No, I don't like that at all.
Yeah. But it's how we use that to, if you want something cheap as dirt, use dirt, and local dirt's even better. And so encouraging that research and design and seeing where that fits into your organization, I think that's sort of the proliferation of renewable energy and how we store it and then use it and that sort of thing. So that'd be our perspective.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, for us, we're looking at the long-term supply, be able to transfer it on to Aboriginal partners, those sorts of things. So it's a lot more than just an energy thing. But what we're really struggling with, and one of the reasons I'm here today is to learn as much as most of everybody else. But until it's to the point where the renewable solar or wind can 100% replace diesel, for new projects, it's just adding a big upfront cost. And a big upfront capital cost on a project is the worst thing you can do to your rate of return on the ability of, or the interest in other people to invest in your project. So we're really running up against that. How do you solve the doubling up of your capital for in many cases, only a 9, 10, 12-year life of mine, so you don't get that same return on investment. So that's our biggest problem right now, and we're here to try and keep an eye on what that storage technology is going to do for us so that we can completely avoid the diesel in these remote northern locations.
You've kind of touched on sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I'd just like to touch on what Mark said there. In our case, we're looking at a life of mine at this stage of 10 years, and with potential for a lot of expansion if we go underground. We're busy with the feasibility at the moment, but we have, without capital, if we get the funding from our corporate, without interest on capital, should I say, we've got a 2-year payback period. It's a no-brainer. With capital repayment at Prime plus 1 in Namibia, we've got a 5-year payback period. And so it really is very, very easy these days to justify. If you're living in a good environment with a lot of sun, it's easy to justify the expenditure up front. Frankly, if we had put the plant in up front, obviously it would raise the the startup capital of the operation, and investors would have looked at it askew, I guess, but we would have saved a whole lot more money, and it would have been paid off by now already. So the fact that we've had to do it 3 years into the operation is a pity. It makes that much sense that you've just got to do it. It's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned.
I'm glad it actually worked out really well, because I was going to come back to Chris on that, and you illustrated the point. I was going to touch on a few things around, you said, doing the proper analysis, and I had started off earlier asking about some of the enablers. We'd spoken about internal focus and expertise, having the right focus and support, but the two other things that to me come to mind are capital allocation and then rates of return in terms of how you make these decisions, and you've all kind of touched on that now, but I wouldn't mind delving into a little bit more. You said something, I think, quite interesting there, which is, if we had just done this at the beginning, it would have made more sense. But this trade-off between capital allocation for efficiency initiatives versus capital allocation, to boost production. And Chris, I'll start with you. When you do the proper analysis, how important is it to have these parameters, again, formalized, codified, and well spelled out? And from an investment decision perspective, is that something that is done at Teck? Is it clear in everyone's mind what the parameters are when it comes to rates of return and how capital is allocated?
I mean, the more you have it codified, the easier it is for people doing the analysis to do in a standard way and to have a common conversation amongst your decision makers in the organization of what kind of decision you want to make. I think that's sort of the easy answer to the question. I think what you need in the organization, though, are people who either have courage or people who show the leadership to pull out some of those key decisions you can make and have a more robust debate. I mean, we can set a payback period and say, okay, anything below this or anything longer than this, we're not going to pursue. One of the interesting parts about Teck is I think sometimes we try to stay away from being too, not structured, but tie ourselves down to a certain rule. So for us, I think it's first of all, having that structure, but then incentivizing people and having good support teams that can help people do those analysis. And I don't want to go into the specific project, but we have been looking at two different options at one of our mines. One is a lower carbon option. One of them is a bit more diesel intensive. And so, they had the leadership at their site to reach out and say, well, help us understand what the carbon tax is going to look like in the future. And they ran a fairly detailed analysis on that. But the key, again, is having those people who understand, let's do a trade-off study between these two options and having that support and building that culture. And I think maybe the reason why we're there already is because, we're hearing examples already of where you can save costs, where you could potentially get permitted easier, where your communities are supported by these types of projects. So I think as those success stories build, it'll become more ingrained and it'll be easier. And I guess the last piece I'll say is, and I guess this is a general message to folks, is for every 10 good stories we have as an industry, we're very risk averse. So if you have one bad story, everyone kind of goes, ooh, yeah, okay, we don't want to play in this risky area anymore. Whether or not it's risky, it's perceived risk to folks. So, it's important that both the mining companies and the folks here who can help us find lower carbon options, if we're going to go down a pathway, we got to do this together and we got to pick good projects. Because, we're a fairly risk-averse industry. Everyone's nodding.
Please go ahead, Mark.
I think the practical application of this is in the building of an operation. So you think about this for a second. You've got hundreds of engineers designing a project, $1 billion hole in the ground. And then the energy manager comes in and says, well, that's good, but I'm going to take that, look at that through an energy lens, carbon lens, water lens. And to get that buy-in for the rest of the organization, everybody's going, well, I'm not so sure. I want somebody reviewing my design. And that's what an energy design review is set to do. Now, ours, expanded to include carbon, to include water, to include natural gas. And so for the people, think about the lead engineer and the project director sitting there, now I'm going to, they're going to go through all my stuff. They're going to take a look at it. And I have to tell you, this is going back a few years, people were pretty adverse to this. But once we got into the process, and Emily's here, I don't know if she's going to speak about that later tomorrow, but once we got into the process, everybody got engaged. And what we found as we went through is most of the stuff was done really well. So electrification was done really well. And, Onaping Depth is a long-term project, has been looked at for years and years. But there was opportunities. And so those opportunities, oh yeah, we could do this better, from shaft diameter and that sort of thing, where we looked at that actually got built into the design. So that's where, oh yeah, this will save this will save this. And so that it builds, and I guess the sort of how that works in the next phase, where they all kind of came into the process kicking and screaming, it's now, yeah, we want to be a part of this process. We want to do the energy design review. Take a look at it, see what could we have done better. And so the carbon emissions, natural gas usage, electrification, all those things are all part of it. And it's not really delineated, and there's not silos. And I think that's the one sort of really good message, is that that's all those barriers have been broken down. And so you're just doing it more efficiently, better, right? And that, so.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, it's funny, that reminded me, we had a meeting at one of our mines, I don't know, 7 years ago, and we got together a number of the superintendents, some of the senior people at the mine site, talk about our energy goals. And at that time, one of our mine planners said to me, I'm not really sure why I'm here, I don't have much of an impact on energy usage. And we're like, well, actually, you probably have the most significant impact on energy usage. So, getting this design right, thinking about this from the beginning, getting people in different parts of the organization to understand their impacts on energy, on water, on productivity, on safety. They need to think about all these things, but getting that design at the outset, it probably has some of the biggest impact. It's so hard to quantify, and it's not visible to people always, but man, you can make some of your biggest savings, avoidances, whatever word you want to use, by design.
Yeah, I just think it years later, you do, when we did ventilation on demand at Nickel Rim South Project, and Mark's aware of this, people forget what a step change that was. So the, original sort of traditional mine design, you're looking at 170,000 megawatt hour mine. It's at 100,000, 105, like huge because of the built-in technology. And so, so you've got the speed of change of technology. Are you open to it? And it's an iterative process, right? So that you got to keep at it. Sort of full time, and the benefits are there.
So and we'll probably I'll look to Adrian here to see how we're doing on time. Sure. So you mentioned step change, and Chris, you had said a little earlier as well. For every 10 good stories, there's one bad one, and it's a risk-averse industry. I'm curious, external interest, shareholder interest, external interest. There are some step changes being made, some good stories to be told. What kind of initiatives, well, I suppose two parts to the question. One is, what kind of interest are you hearing, are you seeing, if you're a publicly traded company? And then secondly, how are you responding to that? What are some of the things that you're doing to disclose publicly that is helpful? What are some of the things that you have to do, or that you're finding that there's a step up that's needed around disclosure? So maybe we can start with yourself, Mark.
The analysts and investors that we've had pass through our operation, I have to say, are almost without exception very in favor of forward-looking, progressive projects. These guys are modern thinkers. They want to lead their investors towards operations that are not, held back in the past, that are looking at new ways of doing things. The new type of mining is to, as I said a little earlier, embrace communities, embrace not just CSR, corporate social responsibility, in the sense of window dressing or whitewashing. It's a heartfelt, almost a core business, core activity. And in my opinion, with all the leading analysts and investors that I've dealt with, they absolutely love these ideas. So there's no doubt that, with all the kudos you're going to get from the analysts and investors and the economic gain you're going to get from the plant itself, that it's win-win all the way. I'm hugely positive about that. What I'd like to say about the earlier question regarding, policy and codification of solar, I think it's important that we all realize that one has to look at every operation on a case-by-case basis. And if codification means that you must investigate, it's almost your responsibility to investigate whether or not it could be viable for this particular operation, whether you're in the rainforests of South America or in the desert of Namibia, that you would, as part of your design, definitely look at that. I think that part of codification is important. But to push it beyond that, beyond viability, I think would be silly. You'd end up looking at making the operation a higher cost per ounce producer, cost per ton producer. That doesn't make any sense. So one has to be careful with legislation. Legislation, especially in the European environment, I was working for a big European company called Solvay. We were driven by legislation rather than by common sense. Mm-hmm. So one has to be very careful with that.
Yeah. We'll come back to that if we have a few minutes. I'm curious, Mark Wiseman, for you, external interest, while not necessarily the same as some of the larger public companies, I'm sure there's still external interest and you still tell the story as well. What are some of the key interest points when it comes to energy, climate change?
Well, yeah, certainly all of our customers are very interested in what we're going to do and actually in some cases maybe actually participating. Investors, we're all over the map, particularly when you're at the exploration development stage. You have some investors saying, why are you doing a sustainability report? You could put another hole in the ground to, one that's very well involved and knowledgeable, and all saying, well, yeah, this is a way you can save money. And we saved a huge quantity of money by having a solar panel that allowed us to go to electrical heaters for our tents, which saved 80–90% in our heating costs. And that was major and significant. The market that we're in, we have to be looking at this on an ongoing basis and looking at the opportunities and the rapid change in the technology. And we're really hoping that we can get to the storage stage and 100% relying on renewables, so that we're going to be able to have a non-GHG producing mine. It's really difficult at 50 below in the middle of nowhere where there's no roads, and your construction costs for your wind generator is 3 times what it is in the Southern Ontario and all those sorts of things. But if you're not looking at those and analyzing them, you're going to be criticized by everybody out there who's interested in your project. So it's absolutely a critical thing that we have to do, and it's generally very well received.
Chris, from your perspective, external interest?
We've always had interest from investors, from external groups, but I'd say with the task force on climate-related financial disclosures coming out, it's just growing more and more. We're getting questions all the time. I have a feeling a year from now, my job will be solely responding to these types of inquiries. But just to sort of add one other point that I don't think we've touched on yet, which I think is the most interesting part about investor interest in disclosing on the risks and opportunities tied to climate change, is the group of people we have here today. And I'm going to oversimplify, but we've got our mining groups and we've got a renewable energy group, or low carbon groups. And when we think about the opportunities in a low carbon economy, the mines need the support from these companies to find lower carbon options, but of course we need to supply the metals and minerals to produce those technologies. And the exciting thing for me on a day-to-day now is going through all these different reports from the World Bank, Clean Energy Canada. There's a whole bunch of organizations talking about what a low carbon economy means for metal demand, what it means for mineral demand. And so I'm coming at that from the lens of the disclosure piece, but people are asking these questions, and I think mining and the renewable energy side or the low carbon side have a really nice story to tell going forward. And I think, that's the part I'm most excited about on this, is just looking at forecasts of increased copper demand or zinc demand as a copper and zinc miner in a low carbon economy.
That's great. And Mark, for yourselves, in terms of, I suppose, external interest disclosure and maybe even telling that story around opportunities related to that, is that something that features for you?
Well, yeah, and I think, you talk about shareholders and external interest. If they're voting with their money, that's a pretty strong indication. And so when you're building a mining project and you have the traditional, and so ventilation on demand, yep, we're all good at that and we do that. And what's the next piece? Okay, electrification. That's a done deal. And so the whole mine design comes with that. There's tens of millions of dollars of additional cost in developing that. But that's the way it's going to be done, because it has to be done. And it has to be done that for several reasons, right? And it starts with employee health and safety. So when you start at those fundamentals and the electrification of your underground vehicles, burning diesel in a confined space, call it a mine, probably not the best thing in the world to do. If you can electrify that, reduce the heat, improve the air quality, And if your investor is willing to give you an extra 60, 70, 80 million dollars to do that, that's a pretty strong vote. So I would say there's a clear line between investor and shareholder and project development. And I think it's just the way it's going to be done now.
Yeah, and telling that story externally, absolutely.
Yes.
I wonder if we don't break here and maybe go to questions. Yeah.
Hello? Okay. We're going to try it with this. I have a terrible throw, so I might just pass it to you and ask you to throw it. Do you have any questions for the panel? Oh, perfect.
So Doug Urban, Chief Technology Officer for Renewables. Question for Chris. How do mining companies do outreach for new technology? We all know that sometimes the best technology comes from outer space, some other industry. So what's the process?
So the process is sort of a two-way street, and I'd say this is actually one of the challenges we have right now is the overwhelming number of groups coming to tech saying, I've got an idea, and I can't tell you how much time I spend meeting with different groups, just simply trying to understand what they're offering and what their value proposition is. I'd say that's a challenge for us. We're getting better at starting to think about what technologies have we screened and thinking about where is the opportunity. So we're becoming more structured in that sense. But your question too, if I understand, maybe thinking also outside of the industry, this is actually part of the conversation we had last week, which was how do you leverage learnings in other sectors? Tech is uniquely positioned in some ways in the sense that we're a mining company, but we also have projects, operations coming up in Alberta and the oil sands. And so we're a member of COSIA, so we keep an eye on what are the oil sands folks doing. I think some of it too is just being open to those different technologies. One of the technologies we have at one of our mines, I won't go into detail on that specific technology, but its first application was in the food processing industry. So part of it's being open-minded to it, but I think some of it is also tech's fortunate in the sense that, we've got a number of mines, but we've got a couple of corporate offices, and we have those resources who can catalog and who can be strategic about where we look next. But if you don't have corporate support or if you've got limited resources at your operation, our mines alone would really be challenged to try and take in all these different technologies that are coming to them. I think that answers most of where I can come from a tech perspective.
Good deal, I like that. My name is Peter Bradshaw. You've touched on some of this, but I'd like a bit of an expansion from you. Do any of your companies fund fundamental research at various spots, like to double the efficiency of solar panels, to store energy much better, to use your data right from exploration through to tailings enclosure and environment? So to get a sea change that rather than just an incremental change, and you've referred to a couple that have occurred, but the fundamental research as opposed to using what's coming out of other people and adapting it to your own case.
Let's start with you, Mike.
So sure, being in a Sudbury mining camp, if you will, we're pretty fortunate. So Laurentian University has a great big think tank. We participate there. We provide senior engineers, cash, in-kind services, working with, I think Dean Miller is here, so we'd be working with those professors on pure research and design. And so that's, and lending senior design engineers into those organizations. So it's not just a cash, here's some cash, go away, figure it out. Here's the people, here's the money, and here's some research. And then, much to some chagrin, you'll have PhD students and I'll go in and listen to what they have, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. I see people laughing, they've seen me do this before. So it's that great feedback. What works in the ivory tower can be torn apart pretty quickly by somebody who's worked in operations a long time in mills and smelters and that sort of thing. So that dynamic feedback between the educational institutions and the research and the companies it's a win-win situation.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I think there are cases where we do. If there's a material opportunity for us or a material risk that we can mitigate, we'll look often as a company at one-off investments. Where I think that the funding model you're describing or sort of alluding to is better positioned is through some of the industry associations. And I'll just go back to COSIA for a second. I think COSIA, sorry if you don't know, Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance based in Alberta, they're well positioned, and we sort of have a technology pipeline and looking at some of the early innovation. And those are some of the really good areas to leverage your dollars to get those more breakthrough technologies. It's not that companies aren't interested in it. I think there's a recognition that we have a certain expertise and that there are other expertise out there. There's other ways to fund that expertise. It's kind of tricky. You don't want to put too much into just one horse there, right? So we kind of balance that of watching the way the landscape evolves. But when we see some key opportunities for us, whether it's around batteries, this is a bit more developed, but our LNG pilot that we did, and I'll talk about that later. There's an openness to it. We'll do it. It's just it's a balance.